Chapter 2 Retribution is an underwhelming game. I've beaten Saints and Sinners about 5 times now, and it's still one of my favorite games to play for whatever reason, because there are plenty of issues with the game. I was hoping Chapter 2 would fix these issues, and while it did fix some, it left a lot more issues in its path. You know, I was quite excited to see how the game series would expand in the sequel, but it didn't deliver much, and there's no better way to explain the problems with Chapter 2 Retribution than to start all the way at the beginning of the series. In Walking Dead Saints and Sinners, you play as the protagonist known as the Tourist, an outsider of New Orleans, Louisiana, also known as NOLA, where the game's setting takes place. A man named Henri, which the Tourist had saved prior to the beginning of the game, tells the tale of the Reserve, a hidden disaster relief bunker from before the apocalypse that has food and supplies to support hundreds of people just waiting to be found. Henri offers a split of the resources in exchange for the Tourist's help, and after Henri is sadly killed over his information of the Reserve by the Tower faction, the player goes on a journey of scavenging supplies and information to help Casey, a man over the radio that is stuck in the Reserve, to get out so the player can reap all the rewards of the Reserve. Throughout the story and gameplay, you decide the outcome of various situations and have freedom to make choices on what you want to do. If you want to kill a person to collect a key part of your goal to open the Reserve, you can do so. You can dispose of as many people as you want, but there are consequences for some of your actions. If you mess with the Tower faction too much, they'll send soldiers to your base to find you. If you kill JB, the leader of the Reclaimed faction, the Tower will turn a blind eye to your actions. Not everything is decidable, but you still get the opportunity to make decisions throughout normal gameplay. At the end of the game, you do find the Reserve under a church, but while Casey tries to open the Reserve, it malfunctions due to a flood of water still remaining above the Reserve, and the church lights up for everyone to see. This causes a war to start outside of the Reserve against the two factions, and you can decide what side you want to take, whether it's with the Tower, the Reclaimed, or nobody. You make your way towards the controls to open the Reserve fully, but the player is then left with a moral dilemma. With a flood over the Reserve preventing the opening of it, you must redirect where the water goes, and you're only left with 3 options. Route the water to the armory to save Casey in the comms room, but lose all the supplies you came for. Route the water to the comms room to get all the supplies of the Reserve to yourself, but killing Casey in the process, or flood the entire Reserve so that nobody gets it, which is the option that JB proposes to the player. After whatever choice the player makes, you go towards the center of the church and see May, the leader of the Exiles, which are people that were outcast from the Tower faction and are actively hunted by them. Unfortunately, May's daughter and her followers were ruthlessly killed by the Tower just as they were making their escape out of NOLA, and sees no end or redemption for anyone in NOLA, and threatens to ring the bell of the church, attracting any and all infected within the area and thus killing all people fighting outside of the church. On top of this, if you saved Casey, he will threaten to kill May to prevent this. So now the player is again left with another moral dilemma. Do you kill May to save the ruthless people and war outside? Do you kill Casey so May can enact her revenge? Do you do nothing? Hell, do you kill both of them and ring the bell yourself? The player is genuinely left to decide how the game ends and what happens to the people of New Orleans. I loved this about Saints and Sinners and was a core part of the game, even in small interactions with people. Now, the reason I talked about all of this is because in the sequel, none of your choices mattered. All of your decisions are predetermined in Chapter 2 and have basically no effect in the sequel. You must imagine how terrible it felt for me when I launched Chapter 2 and realized that everything I did personally was disregarded. This is by far the worst aspect of this game in my opinion, and leaves an incredibly bad impression to anyone that actually played Saints and Sinners, and sadly it doesn't get better. Not only did they void all the freedom you had in Saints and Sinners, they essentially copied the entire first game, added a couple new things, created some sort of a story, and called it a sequel. It's embarrassing, really. There are many problems with this, starting off with how the sequel just doesn't make sense. The character you play as, the Tourist, is called that because they don't stay in one place too often. They are always traveling and living a nomadic lifestyle, and you only made the exception to live in a base so you could uncover the Reserve in Saints and Sinners. With that now over, what real reason does the tourist have to stay? The tower is already familiar with where the tourist lives, so why don't we live true to our name and leave the area or leave NOLA entirely? At the very least, let's get a new base location that's still within New Orleans, but no. The player is in the same exact location as the first game, and not only that, we also visit the same exact locations from the first game as well. In total, there are only 3 new locations to explore: Hotel Eclair, which is where Chapter 2 begins, Bourbon Street, and the Tower Faction base. If you genuinely think that I, as a player of Saints and Sinners, want to explore the exact same locations and slap 3 mediocre locations to the game, then you'd be wrong. It really feels like an insult with how similar both games are. The games are so similar, in fact, that the sequel doesn't even use a different file extension for the game. And to explain what I mean, when I went to record footage for Chapter 2, I had played Saints and Sinners before, and I didn't have to change what software I was recording because it was already recording the same game. This is obviously not a big thing by itself, but it just shows you how they took the first game, made a glorified DLC, and called it a separate game. Hell, you get tips about the Trials game mode that isn't even in Chapter 2 when you play Chapter 2. How embarrassing. To continue, both cutscenes at the beginning of both games are visually almost identical. And on top of that, you still have to upgrade the same workbenches from the first game, go to the same locations, collect the same loot, collect the same collectibles, and find the same secret recipes. I can understand that VR games are not easy to make, however, games with this scale aren't easy to make in the first place. I'm not going to make any exceptions in my opinions or thoughts about this game just because it's a VR game and takes more work to create. Chapter 2 functionally is exactly the same as the previous game, and very little actually gets innovated or changed at all. I would have gladly waited much longer for an actual sequel to Saints and Sinners, because it had just been under 3 years since Saints and Sinners when Chapter 2 released. So they had plenty of time to work on and create a new experience, but instead they thought of just releasing the same game over again. I really hope they didn't release Chapter 2 because of greed, but man does it feel like it with how little there is different from game to game. Even with everything I've already said, it still doesn't get better, because the human AI is absolutely garbage. You can shotgun someone right next to another person and they won't notice. You will hit a medium-range shot on a tower member and all the other tower members won't bat an eye. You'll hide in plain sight and nobody will see you. You'll shoot from above and they will have no idea what to do. It's terrible. It breaks all immersion and the actual purpose of them existing, since you can easily slaughter someone within 5 feet of another person and they won't notice. It's crazy the lack of improvement the AI got from the first game to the sequel, and it seemed to have gotten worse. With VR games, immersion is by far the most important aspect you need to nail, especially for a game like Saints and Sinners, and it did not deliver any improvements in Chapter 2. Now that my rant is over, I can talk about what exactly is different between both games and what I think about them. First, there are 2 new crafting stations to work with and upgrade, a new weapon station and a gadget station. Both are cool additions to the game and are the biggest gameplay changes from Saints and Sinners. Having new weapons and mechanics like the gloves to mess around with are by far the most refreshing part of Chapter 2, and I like what they did. However, I wish the secret weapons weren't just copy and pastes of the previous weapons in the crafting station, and actually had something that made them different mechanic-wise. They did a good job with the secret lever action rifle in Saints and Sinners, which is one of my favorite weapons to use, and the secret melee weapons you could get as well are for the most part unique and have functional differences between them, but this new weapons crafting bench just didn't hit the mark as hard as the old ones when it comes to the recipes and lack of. The gadget station adds more things to find, but they are simply organic items you pick up just for upgrading this station. It's alright, but the game already suffers from lack of backpack storage, since you need to collect a lot of items just to be able to upgrade or craft one thing. You end up relying on the game to essentially give you cases of materials so you can actually make progress with your crafting stations. Either way, the station itself adds many more unique items to mess around with, like flares, grenades, and gloves. These all have their uses, even if you don't utilize them all the time. The gloves by themselves are honestly OP as hell, since they literally just act like melee weapons that you don't need to carry, and they have a lot of durability on top of each hand degrading independently, meaning you have 2 one-shot melee weapons that you don't even carry in your hand. It's honestly very fun to have such versatility with what you can bring, since you don't even need to worry about melee weapons if you're using gloves, but I would be lying if I said these aren't extremely powerful and a must-have. Overall, I like what the benches offer, although it still lacks recipes compared to the normal workbenches. I also like how Chapter 2 adds more means of eliminating enemies with the new weapons and gadgets you acquire. The Walker AI has definitely gotten a bit better, and they're also more dynamic with their animations, although the Walkers still suffer from bugs and glitches. The combat has also been slightly improved, namely the weird sway that occurred in the first game is mostly reduced and less obnoxious. This makes aiming smoother and more consistent, but this doesn't mean the game has lost all of its jankiness. The areas to grab your equipment are still quite large, and you tend to accidentally grab the wrong things in dire moments. The animations in the game are still unpolished and unrealistic in most cases, and the expressions NPCs make can be quite concerning. The weirdest issue is how bright white colors sometimes are, especially in light. You'll be scavenging around, grab your journal, and... Yeah, it's quite weird, and it's not just the journal. Like, funnily enough, Henri's facial hair at the beginning can be extremely bright and unnatural, and white colors overall just look like they don't fit with the rest of the color palette. Now, it's finally time to talk about the different areas you can visit in Chapter 2, and as I mentioned before, not much changes from game to game. Chapter 2 leaves the player to visit the same locations with very little changes between them, if any at all. Some areas like Via Corolla and Old Town change with the story, but let's just say that the changes basically prohibit you from visiting those locations again safely, which limits the locations you can actually scavenge and explore from even further. And on top of this, the new locations just aren't enough to call this a new game. The tower is by far the worst location to visit if you're simply looking for a normal immersive experience, because the area surprisingly lacks things to do. You'll barely find any materials that you really need that you wouldn't have found more of in any other location, and the only purpose there is to this area is for the story and if you want to slaughter the tower and suffer no consequences. And that's why I say there is nothing to really do here, because all you can really do is eliminate the tower for fun, and that's it. Hotel Eclair is pretty small and lackluster, although the concept of the location is alright. There's simply not enough to really look forward to with all these new locations, and that's even the same with the previous locations, because oh wow, we already visited them in the first game. Why would I want to visit the same exact locations that I already explored in the first game? I don't get it, and maybe somebody can make sense of it in the comments, but I really dislike the fact that I'm just doing what I did in the first game over again. And last but not least, the story. The story is just there. There really isn't much to it, and it doesn't help that I'm reminded that my decisions from before didn't matter. And newsflash, they still don't really matter in this game either. This is going to be a decently big spoiler from late into the game, so if you really don't want to see this, then I'd recommend you skip to this timestamp. So in Chapter 2, you have the Pawn King, which is supposed to be a shop and trade network that works with the Exiles, and is run by a man named Sunny, who is accompanied by his daughter Desiree. Because of previous actions that I won't spoil in this game, Desiree wants to kill Sunny, and you're able to talk to her about everything and what she should do. You're given the ability to try to convince her not to kill him, and even right up till the end, you literally get the choice to say not to kill Sunny, straight up. And guess what? Oh my god. Oh, wait, never mind. Okay.
Leave.
I guess it didn't matter in the end, because I have no personal choices. Well, I love how it gave me all the options, and I don't feel like any of my options mattered. None of my options mattered. Okay. Yeah, it seems like it's inevitable. What was the point of me having all these options when it wasn't going to have an impact regardless? It really feels like salt in the wound to the player choice and freedom that was present in Saints and Sinners, and it doesn't get much better, because I believe that Casey might actually be alive in Chapter 2, namely from this piece of description late into the game. And this couldn't have been present in Saints and Sinners, so is Casey still alive? Again, the end of Saints and Sinners had you decide whether he lives or not, so again, the player's choices in the first game are completely invalidated. Something just doesn't add up with why the developers would do these things. To move on, let's talk about Sunny and the Pawn King. The Pawn King and the entire location are literally only there to progress the story. You can't buy anything, sell anything, or do anything with the Pawn King other than talk to progress the mission. The developers literally added a storefront that advertises to all people in NOLA, and you can't do anything in the store. Please make it make sense. Then there are the Exiles, which are connected to the Pawn King for some trade network bullcrap that doesn't actually mean anything in-game either, and you get no bonuses whatsoever for working with the Exiles, going on constant fetch quests to get a mediocre reward that nobody would ever care to actually do, especially since they only come out at night. There is no reason to work with the Exiles, and because of that, I bet most players just skip by them like I did. There are plenty of other moments about the story I could mention, both good and bad especially, but the moral of the story is, you don't play this game for the story. The story is very lackluster and follows the same general path as the first game, and I don't mean to play up the first Saints and Sinners as some story masterpiece, because it was essentially just glorified fetch quest, but the first game inherited the choices matter style of gameplay from previous Walking Dead games, and Chapter 2 basically skinned that all off, slapped some ingredients together, and called it a second game. Saints and Sinners was considered a good game at the time because it was one of the few VR games that had some meat on its bones, a good amount of content to go through and explore, gameplay that was interesting and unique, along with choices the player could make to drastically change the journey you go along. Then, you release Chapter 2 3 years later, and oh, it's the same game with some extras added, with more bugs and glitches, unfixed AI, and a terrible story. So please, let me ask you this. Why was this game made? I really wish this game was released in a better state, but there really isn't much hope for the future honestly, so this game may be left to the side, never to be seen reaching its full potential ever again. If I had to rate this game, I wouldn't be able to rate it any higher than a 4 out of 10, and the gameplay on paper is the only thing really keeping this together. I wanted something different, unique, interesting. Bring us to a different part of New Orleans so we can explore new locations and find new stories. Innovate and improve the crafting system and resource gathering. Offer more unique weapon stats and items like night vision, traps, and actual wearable armor to use to our advantage throughout the journey. Offer new mechanics to the player to make the game even more immersive and interesting. And please, for the love of God, fix the bugs and AI.